It was about 23 minutes into what Adam Schiff seemed to think would be his cleanest victory lap, the kind of made-for-TV moment Washington lives for. The setup looked almost too perfect. A live press conference, an audience counted in the tens of millions, and a long-running antagonist finally given the front-row microphone. Schiff had the posture of a man walking toward a camera with a closing argument already written in his head. Not a man walking into uncertainty. He'd spent years building a public identity around the idea that he knew things you didn't, that he'd seen things you couldn't see, that the evidence was there, locked behind classification. And then, right when the choreography demanded the old pattern, accuse, deny, shout, cut to panel, Donald Trump pressed a button and changed the genre. Trump didn't start with a rant or a nickname or a grievance that wandered off into the weeds. He started with paper, or at least the modern equivalent of paper, a document blown up to 10 feet tall on screens flanking the podium. The claim wasn't subtle, and that's what made it dangerous to everyone in the room. He said he had declassified the record of what lawmakers were actually briefed, and he was going to show it in public. If that's true, the usual insulation disappears. The usual "trust me" shield turns transparent, and the audience suddenly gets to play referee. Schiff's brand, like the brand of many officials, depended on the public not having access to the exact words behind the closed door. The moment those words appear, the public stops guessing and starts comparing. On the screens, the date and the label mattered almost as much as the content because dates don't debate and labels don't blush. Trump pointed to a briefing described as a House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, Gang of Eight session, dated March 15, 2017, marked Declassified January 15, 2025. He highlighted language that, in his telling, cut against the most famous line Schiff repeated in the early Russia years, that he'd seen more than circumstantial evidence. The displayed assessment, as presented, leaned the other way, emphasizing that contacts alone did not prove coordination, and that investigators had not found evidence of conspiracy at that time. That's where the tension begins, because the public doesn't need to know everything to recognize a basic clash between no evidence found to date and more than circumstantial evidence. And once a clash is visible, a question forms that no amount of cable news choreography can erase. What exactly did the audience get told, and why? The camera loves faces in those moments, not because faces prove facts, but because faces reveal surprise. Schiff, who has spent years wearing the practiced expression of the burdened adult in the room, suddenly looked like he was recalculating where the exits were. Maybe it was nothing more than the jolt of seeing classified-styled pages on giant screens, the kind of thing Washington tries to keep behind curtains. Maybe it was irritation at a political opponent controlling the presentation. Or maybe it was the dawning awareness that the safest defense, "I can't discuss classified details," was no longer available if the details were now public. When a politician's strongest shield disappears, you find out quickly whether the rest of the argument can stand on its own. Trump didn't stop at the document. He went for the attendance log, the thing that turns an abstract briefing into a personal receipt. If the signature page is real, it does more than say, "Someone briefed someone" in general. It says a specific person was in the room and acknowledged it. Trump used that to frame a blunt either-or that plays well on television because it feels like logic. Were the public statements accurate, or was the briefing accurate? Of course, real life often offers third options: ambiguous language, shifting assessments, different definitions of evidence, the difference between proof and suspicion. But television doesn't reward nuance. It rewards contrast. And contrast, was exactly what Trump was building. He wasn't asking America to become intelligence analysts. He was asking them to notice a mismatch. Then came the part designed to remove the wiggle room, a timeline of Schiff's public appearances. Trump asserted that his team counted 227 instances over roughly 2 years in which Schiff said some version of "I've seen evidence," and he paired that with the content of briefings Trump claimed said the opposite. If you're watching at home, you may not know whether the number is accurate, but you can understand what the number is meant to do. It turns a misstatement into a pattern. And once something is framed as a pattern, the human mind starts looking for motive, not just mistake. Did Schiff mean evidence in a broader political sense, while briefers meant it in a prosecutorial sense? And did he ever clarify that difference for viewers? Or did the ambiguity serve him, letting him sound certain while staying insulated from verification? The supercut concept is cruel because it doesn't require the audience to remember. It replays the memory for them. A clip on one network can be explained away as heat-of-the-moment rhetoric. 10 clips can be argued as evolving information, an intelligence picture that changes. But dozens of clips stitched together becomes a rhythm, and rhythm makes a claim feel like an anthem. When an anthem clashes with a document, the anthem starts to sound like marketing. And that's the heart of the suspicion Trump was trying to ignite. That classification wasn't just protection, it was a stage prop. At that point, the story's momentum stops being about Trump and becomes about the public's relationship with institutional credibility. You can hate Trump, you can distrust his motives, you can assume he is framing the materials selectively, and still find yourself staring at a simple question. If officials repeatedly told the public they'd seen evidence they could not show, and then the shown record appears to contradict the claim, what does that do to the next crisis, when the public is asked to trust us again? Trust is not a renewable resource in politics. It's a bank account, and withdrawals add up. Schiff, in this telling, wasn't just facing an opponent. He was facing the idea that secrecy can be abused even when the speaker insists it's for your own good. And once that idea lodges in people's minds, it spreads faster than any rebuttal. Trump then pivoted into something older, but still radioactive: the Ukraine phone call and the impeachment era. He brought up Schiff's dramatic essence reading, the moment that defenders called parody and critics called distortion. The basic point wasn't whether Schiff was allowed to characterize, it was whether the characterization sounded like quotation while being something else. In politics, the difference between "here's my summary" and "here's what was said" is the difference between argument and evidence. If the public believes it heard a transcript when it heard a performance, that creates a credibility wound that doesn't heal easily. And if Trump can place the performance next to the actual transcript, he can make Schiff look like someone who treated the record like clay. The question for viewers isn't simply, was Schiff wrong, because wrong happens. The sharper question is whether Schiff's style of communication, grave certainty, tight phrases, heavy implication, made it easy for audiences to walk away believing more than he technically said. When Schiff said, "the essence," did most people process that as the general meaning? Or did they process it as basically the words? You don't need to love Trump to notice how many Americans heard that moment as an actual account of what Trump told Volodymyr Zelensky. And you don't need to be a lawyer to see why that matters in an impeachment context where the public is asked to judge legitimacy. If the prosecution voice sounds too theatrical, the defense doesn't even need to win on facts. It can win on distrust. From there, Trump moved into the whistleblower episode and the dispute over contacts between Schiff's office and the complainant. The allegation has been around for years in political circles. Schiff's team had some form of interaction before the complaint went formal, and Schiff later claimed no direct contact. There are layers there, and layers are where Washington hides. Staff contact isn't my contact. Helping someone find process isn't coordinating. Direct can be defined narrowly. But the optics are what Trump was harvesting, because optics can turn those layers into a single impression. That the investigator had a hand in the instrument that launched the investigation. If the public sees a timeline of meetings, calls, and then a complaint, it doesn't care about legalistic definitions. It cares about perceived setup. And perceived setup is corrosive, even when the technical defense is real. Then came the Hunter Biden laptop chapter, the one that still makes people talk like they're walking around glass. Trump's framing was that Schiff had been briefed on authenticity and still publicly described the story as Russian disinformation. That's a serious claim, but notice how it works. It turns a debate about interpretation into a debate about whether someone said the opposite of what they were told. The laptop episode also carries the extra sting of timing because it unfolded close to an election, when narratives can become votes. If a politician labels a story Russian disinformation, the label isn't just commentary. It's a social permission slip for platforms, media, and voters to dismiss it. The skeptical question is not, was Schiff trying to help Biden? Because motive is hard to prove. The question is, what did he believe at the time, and why did he speak with such certainty? Trump layered on the 51 former intelligence officials' letter, another item that sits at the intersection of authority and persuasion. That letter didn't claim definitive knowledge, but it carried the weight of titles and experience, and weight is persuasive even without proof. The controversy, as critics tell it, is whether politicians or political staffs nudged or encouraged the framing, turning what looked like organic concern into coordinated messaging. If Trump can show emails that appear to involve Schiff's orbit, it becomes a story not just about one letter, but about how the credential class can be mobilized to shape what the public thinks is safe to believe. And if the public starts to suspect coordination, it stops trusting signatures and starts treating them like endorsements purchased with access. Here's where the narrative becomes less about whether any single claim is fully correct, and more about how the audience experiences contradiction. Trump's method, in the story you're telling, is to stack contradictions until the viewer feels trapped by them. Briefing says, no evidence to date, then a TV appearance says more than circumstantial evidence. Transcript says one thing, then a dramatic reading suggests another thing. A forensic question about a device becomes a sweeping label about disinformation. Maybe each incident has a defense in isolation, a context argument, a nuance argument, an evolution argument. But politics doesn't let you argue isolation. It forces you to answer the pattern. And the pattern, as Trump frames it, is that Schiff repeatedly used the aura of classified knowledge to speak with the confidence of a fact-finder. If you're writing this as American political commentary, you don't have to declare Schiff guilty of anything to make it compelling. You simply have to keep asking the kind of questions that sound like they should have answers by now. Why, after years of saying, "I've seen evidence," did Schiff never offer the public a clearer definition of what he meant by evidence? If he meant, "I've seen enough to suspect," why didn't he say that plainly instead of using prosecutorial language that implied proof? If the intelligence picture evolved, why do the highlighted contradictions appear immediately after specific briefings, rather than years later when evolution would make sense? And if Trump's presentation is selective, why hasn't Schiff, or anyone allied with him, responded by pointing to specific declassified pages that rebut the story line by line? A sharper writer can add a touch of sarcasm without becoming personal, and Washington invites it. Imagine telling the public, year after year, "I've seen the evidence," while also telling the public, year after year, You can't see the evidence. That's not a normal claim. That's a claim built like a moat. It protects the speaker from verification because if you can't see it, you can't contradict it. It also flatters the audience into compliance because skepticism can be framed as naive or worse, disloyal. And then, suddenly, the drawbridge drops because the evidence is supposedly declassified, and the public discovers the castle doesn't look the way it was described. In the story's most cinematic beat, Trump turns the press conference from Q&A into cross-examination. He doesn't argue with Schiff's politics, he argues with Schiff's own record. He makes the audience watch Schiff watch himself, which is the kind of humiliation you can't spin away with a statement later. The tension is in the silence, because silence communicates something, even when it doesn't prove anything. A confident rebuttal would change the temperature in the room. A detailed correction would shift the conversation to nuance and context. But hesitation, visible hesitation, tells the audience the debate isn't safe. At this stage, the public also starts wondering about the media's role, because the media was part of the original cycle. If Schiff said, "I've seen evidence on television hundreds of times," why didn't interviewers push harder on definitions, timelines, and what exactly evidence meant? The easy answer is that they couldn't, because the record was classified. But that's not an excuse. That's the point. Classification can turn journalists into stenographers because they can't check the receipt, and they can't demand proof without being told they're endangering national security. It's the oldest trick in the modern information game. Wrap your claim in secrecy and watch skepticism turn into taboo. If Trump's declassification stunt did nothing else, it forced people to stare at the vulnerability. When Trump shifts from Russia to leaks, phone records, reporter calls, tight timing, he's stepping into another zone where audiences form strong impressions without knowing every detail. A phone call to a reporter is not, by itself, wrongdoing, and any honest narrator should admit that. But a repeated pattern of calls followed by stories containing details from closed briefings, if shown convincingly, makes people ask whether the line between oversight and narrative management was blurred. The public doesn't need to understand the technicalities of leak investigations to understand what a coincidence looks like when it repeats 40 times. Coincidence can happen once. It can happen twice. When it happens over and over, people start using different words. And once the word pattern has taken hold, the story becomes a morality play about power and permission. Schiff is not just a senator in this telling. He's a symbol of a class of officials who speak with moral certainty while holding information others can't audit. Trump, in this telling, is not just a president. He's a showman who realizes that the strongest weapon against that class is the public display of their own paperwork. You don't have to trust Trump's character to see how that weapon works. He can be petty and still be effective. He can be self-interested and still land a hit. The audience may despise him and still find themselves watching, because the spectacle is also a referendum on credibility. Then the narrative invites the audience to look backward and reinterpret years of political conflict through the lens of what if the certainty was oversold? If Schiff's public posture was stronger than what briefings justified, what did that do to the national temperature? How much of the country's rage was fueled by language that sounded like proof? How many reputations were scorched? How many institutions were distrusted because viewers were told it's worse than you think without being shown the underlying record? Those are not accusations. They're consequences, and consequences don't require criminality to be real. A politician can operate within the law and still damage public trust by being careless with implication. The story also holds a mirror to partisan psychology because everyone tends to forgive their own side's methods while condemning the other sides. If Trump had used classification to imply secret proof without revealing it, would Schiff have treated that as acceptable, or would he have treated it as a scandal? If Schiff used heavy implication to build a narrative, would Trump's critics have demanded more precision, or did they accept the implication because they liked the direction of the conclusion? Hypocrisy is bipartisan, and that's why these stories travel so well. They let viewers feel morally awake without realizing they're selecting which standards to apply. A good commentator doesn't let the audience off that hook. A good commentator forces the audience to ask whether they cared about verification when verification was inconvenient. As the press conference sequence continues, the core drama is not that a document exists, but that a document is used like a spotlight. The spotlight doesn't just illuminate, it isolates. It takes a complex story and frames it as a simple contradiction. And simple contradictions are the raw material of political downfall. Schiff's problem in this narrative is that his career was built on a claim that the public could not verify until now. Trump's advantage in this narrative is that he understood the public doesn't need to read all 847 pages to feel the effect of one highlighted paragraph. Give them a date, give them a signature, give them a clip, and let their suspicion do the rest. Suspicion is the most efficient engine in modern politics, and once it's running, it doesn't need fuel. It feeds itself. If you're the narrator, you can lean into the uncomfortable middle, the place where you don't assert guilt, but you also don't accept the easy dismissals. Out of context is often a true phrase, but it's also a convenient one because it can be used like an eraser without ever showing the missing context. Evolving intelligence is often a true reality, but it can also be used to justify statements that were made with total certainty at the time, not tentative language. The audience can feel that difference even if they can't articulate it. They remember whether someone sounded cautious or sounded sure. Schiff sounded sure for years, and Trump's framing depends on that memory. And so the story reaches the point where Trump asks a question that is more performance than inquiry. How many times did you mislead the public? Notice the careful phrasing a safe narrator uses. Mislead can be intentional, but it can also be reckless, sloppy, too certain, too theatrical. That ambiguity is what keeps the question potent while avoiding a courtroom claim. It also mirrors the ambiguity that made Schiff's public language so powerful in the first place. I've seen evidence can be a precise statement, or it can be a vibe, and vibes are how narratives spread. Trump wants the audience to decide it was a vibe that pretended to be a fact. Schiff, if he had the perfect answer, would want the audience to decide it was a careful truth that was misunderstood. When the press conference ends, the story doesn't end. It multiplies because the modern political ecosystem rewards clips over context. A Schiff facial reaction becomes a meme because it's easy to share. A split screen of briefing language versus TV language becomes a weapon because it's easy to understand. A montage of repeated phrases becomes a cudgel because repetition looks like intent. The audience isn't reading, they're absorbing. They're not weighing footnotes, they're counting seconds. And in that world, the person who controls the visual controls the verdict, even if the verdict is just a public mood. The aftershocks you describe, ethics complaints, calls for removal from committees, polling collapses, censure talk, should be handled the same way, as reported reactions and plausible political consequences rather than declared facts. You can say, reports of complaints began to circulate. Calls grew louder. Some lawmakers signaled distance. Polling narratives shifted without locking yourself into claims that require perfect verification. The point isn't to declare the numbers, it's to describe the sensation of a political earthquake. the way elite protection can vanish overnight when the story becomes toxic. Washington is full of brave allies until the first bad headline, and then suddenly, everyone is concerned and watching closely. The hypocrisy in that is its own punchline, and you can tap it without insulting protected groups or calling anyone names. A narrator can also build tension by pointing out what isn't happening. Where is the detailed rebuttal, the page-by-page correction, the calm explanation that aligns statements with documents? Where are the clips of Schiff using careful language like "I suspect" or "I'm concerned" instead of "I've seen evidence"? If that's what he meant. Where are the contemporaneous memos, the contemporaneous notes, the contemporaneous warnings, the public record that shows he urged caution rather than certainty? In politics, silence is rarely empty. It is filled with calculation. And calculation looks terrible on camera when the audience thinks you owe them an explanation. This is where you can add the subtle humor that American audiences like, the kind that's dry, not cruel. Washington loves to talk about transparency initiatives, like their public service, when half the time they're knives wrapped in velvet. It loves to act shocked when a rival uses the same tactics it used last year. It loves to tell you a thing is sacred until it becomes useful, and then suddenly it's in the public interest. In that sense, Trump's press conference is less a break from tradition than a brutally honest display of what tradition always was: power fighting power with whatever tools are available. The only difference is that this time, the tool is a declassification stamp and a set of giant screens. If you keep the voice steady, the piece stays watchable as a long voiceover because it feels like an investigator thinking out loud, rather than a partisan screaming. You're not telling the audience what to think. You're showing them why the questions exist. You're not declaring a crime. You're describing a contradiction that invites skepticism. You're not calling for action. You're asking why institutions didn't demand clarity earlier. And you're not pretending your story is court-certified fact. You're framing it as a troubling public record dispute that, if unresolved, leaves a stain on everyone involved. That's also how you keep it accurate, in the only way accuracy matters in political commentary. You anchor your claims in who said what, when they said it, and what was shown on the screen. Trump claimed he declassified a March 15, 2017 briefing and displayed it. Trump claimed Schiff attended and signed an attendance log. Trump claimed Schiff made repeated media statements like "more than circumstantial evidence," and he played clips to support the claim. Trump contrasted those clips with displayed briefing language. Those are describable events in the story universe without you personally swearing that every underlying document is authentic beyond dispute. The uncomfortable truth about moments like this is that they don't resolve anything cleanly. They just rearrange who is asking the questions and who is stuck answering them. Schiff, in the days after the press conference, wasn't suddenly judged in a courtroom or condemned by some neutral authority. He was judged in the noisier, messier venue of public perception, where hesitation reads like guilt and complexity sounds like evasion. Every attempt to explain nuance had to compete with clips designed to flatten nuance into contradiction. And once that flattening takes hold, even reasonable explanations start sounding like excuses. Politics isn't fair that way, but it is consistent. What followed felt less like a legal reckoning and more like a reputational landslide, the kind that happens when allies quietly step back before anyone asks them to take a stand. Statements from Schiff's defenders grew softer, filled with phrases like "context matters" and "this deserves careful review," which are Washington's equivalent of leaving a party early without saying goodbye. Nobody rushed out with a binder to counter Trump's binder. No one booked a primetime slot to walk through the documents line by line. That absence became part of the story, because absence always speaks. If the contradiction was so easily explained, why wasn't it explained in detail? If the documents were misleading, why not show the misleading parts? The media response revealed another layer of discomfort, one that had been building long before this moment. Networks that had treated Schiff as a reliable narrator for years now found themselves playing defense for their own editorial choices. It wasn't just Schiff's credibility on trial, it was theirs, too. If a senator says, "I've seen evidence on your air repeatedly," and you never ask him to define it precisely, what does that say about your standards? The safer move was to frame Trump's actions as political theater, which they were. But theater doesn't cancel substance. Calling it theater doesn't answer the underlying question of whether the claims being challenged were ever as solid as viewers were led to believe. Trump, for his part, seemed almost content to let others argue about his motives while the documents did the work. He didn't need everyone to believe him. He just needed enough people to doubt Schiff. Doubt is cheaper than belief, and far more contagious. A single unresolved inconsistency can undermine years of certainty, especially when that certainty was enforced by secrecy. Trump understood that dynamic instinctively, maybe better than any politician of his era. He didn't ask the public to trust him. He dared them to distrust someone else. And in a climate already saturated with suspicion, that dare landed. As the story spread online, it morphed the way all viral political moments do, shedding caveats and growing sharper edges. Short clips replaced long explanations, headlines replaced timelines, reaction videos replaced source documents. Schiff's image froze into a few expressions caught at unfortunate angles, while Trump's voiceover lines became captions and sound bites. None of that proved anything, but it shaped everything. Once millions of people have shared a clip with the caption, "Explain this," the burden shifts permanently. The person being asked to explain is no longer speaking to a neutral audience. They're speaking to a jury that thinks it's already seen the evidence. The ethics complaints and calls for investigation that followed didn't need to go anywhere to do their damage. In politics, the existence of a question often matters more than its resolution. Committees announcing reviews, officials saying they are looking into the matter, and leaders declining to comment all feed the sense that something is wrong, even if nothing is ultimately proven. Schiff found himself in that familiar but deadly zone where every denial is reported as a reaction rather than a clarification. When you're reacting, you're losing control of the narrative, and control is the only currency that matters in Washington. There was also an irony that critics of Schiff were quick to point out, and supporters struggled to deflect. For years, Schiff had warned about the danger of misinformation and the abuse of authority, arguing that powerful figures could manipulate the public by distorting facts. Now, he was accused, fairly or not, of doing something uncomfortably similar, using the weight of his position to make claims the public couldn't independently verify. Even if his intentions were different, the parallel was rhetorically devastating. It allowed opponents to turn his own language back on him, which is always more effective than inventing new attacks. Some defenders argued that intelligence work doesn't translate cleanly into public language, that briefings are cautious by design, while public warnings must be urgent to be effective. That may be true, but urgency has a cost. When urgent language is repeated for years without a clear payoff, people start to feel manipulated. The question becomes whether the urgency was meant to inform or to mobilize, to warn or to persuade. Schiff rarely acknowledged that tension publicly, and Trump's presentation exploited that silence. By placing the bureaucratic language of intelligence next to the theatrical language of television, he invited viewers to choose which felt more honest. Another uncomfortable dimension was how easily the story fit into a broader narrative of elite insulation. Schiff was not portrayed as a lone actor, but as part of an ecosystem that included sympathetic media, former officials, and institutional deference. Trump's argument, implicit but clear, was that this ecosystem protected itself by invoking expertise and secrecy, and that declassification was the pin that popped the bubble. Whether or not that framing was complete, it resonated with an audience already primed to believe that insiders play by different rules. In that sense, Schiff became a symbol, and symbols rarely survive nuance. The longer the debate went on, the less it mattered what Schiff said in response, and the more it mattered what he didn't say. He didn't sit down for a long-form interview to walk through his thinking step by step. He didn't publish a detailed memo addressing each highlighted document. Instead, his responses stayed abstract, emphasizing principles rather than particulars. That approach works when the dispute is philosophical, but it fails when the dispute is about dates, signatures, and quotes. People don't want a sermon when they think they've seen a spreadsheet. Trump's critics were left with an awkward dilemma. To defend Schiff aggressively was to defend a style of politics they often criticized when used by others. To distance themselves from Schiff was to concede ground to Trump, a concession many were unwilling to make. So they tried to thread the needle, criticizing Trump's tactics while avoiding full-throated endorsement of Schiff's explanations. That balancing act satisfied no one. Supporters wanted loyalty, skeptics wanted answers, and the middle ground looked like avoidance. As weeks passed, the narrative hardened into something less charitable than either side would have preferred. Schiff was no longer discussed primarily as the investigator of Trump, but as the subject of investigation himself. Headlines shifted tone from "Schiff responds" to "Questions linger," a subtle but important change. Lingering questions suggest permanence, the idea that something unresolved may never be resolved. In politics, that's often worse than a clear finding, because it leaves a shadow that follows you everywhere. Trump, meanwhile, continued to reference the press conference as proof that his grievances had been justified all along. Each time he did, he reminded audiences of the documents without having to show them again. Repetition works both ways. Just as Schiff's repeated claims became a liability, Trump's repeated references became reinforcement. Over time, the specifics blurred, but the impression remained. There was a record, and it didn't say what Schiff said it said. Impressions don't need footnotes to survive. The broader lesson that emerged, intentionally or not, was about the fragility of authority in an era of instant comparison. For decades, classified information gave certain officials an unchallengeable platform. They could speak with certainty because disagreement could be dismissed as ignorance. Declassification, selective or otherwise, disrupts that dynamic. It doesn't guarantee truth, but it democratizes skepticism. Once the public can see even a slice of the record, claims built entirely on trust start to wobble. That wobble extends beyond Schiff or Trump to the institutions both men claimed to defend. Intelligence agencies rely on public confidence, not just secrecy. When their assessments are used rhetorically in ways that appear inconsistent, the agencies themselves take collateral damage. Trump leaned into this paradox, portraying the intelligence community as accurate but misrepresented, which allowed him to attack a political opponent without attacking the institution outright. It was a clever move, one that forced defenders of Schiff to either challenge the agency's credibility or concede the contradiction. Neither option was attractive. In the end, the story didn't need a final verdict to achieve its effect. Schiff's eventual decision not to continue his Senate career, framed as a personal choice, was interpreted through the lens of everything that came before. Supporters saw fatigue and calculation, Critics saw retreat, and the public saw confirmation of a narrative that had already taken hold. Rarely does a political career end with a single definitive blow. More often it ends with 1,000 unanswered questions that make the next campaign impossible. This episode, real or perceived, supplied those questions in abundance. Looking back, the moment in the East Room stands out not because it settled the Russia debate, but because it exposed how much of that debate rested on trust rather than transparency. Schiff's confidence had been built on the assumption that the underlying material would remain unseen. Trump's gamble was that showing it, even partially and strategically, would be enough to flip the burden of proof. Whether that gamble was fair or cynical is almost beside the point. It worked in the way modern politics measures success, by changing what people doubt. And that's why the episode lingers, long after the clips stopped trending and the panels moved on. It left behind an uncomfortable habit of mind, a reflexive question whenever an official claims secret knowledge. What does the record actually say, and who gets to see it? Schiff may have been the central figure in this chapter, but the skepticism it generated won't stop with him. Once an audience learns to ask for receipts, it rarely forgets how. What ultimately unsettled people wasn't the possibility that Adam Schiff had been wrong, or even that he might have overstated his case. Washington forgives those things every day before lunch. What unsettled people was the realization that for nearly a decade, the country had been asked to accept certainty without inspection, gravity without grounding, and moral urgency without receipts. When the receipts finally appeared, curated or not, they didn't close the argument. They cracked it open. And once that crack formed, it became impossible to pretend it had never been there. For many viewers, the lasting image wasn't a document or a clip, but a pause. The moment when a man known for confident declarations suddenly had nothing to say. Silence on television is never neutral. It invites interpretation, suspicion, projection. Some saw it as shock, others as calculation, others as the weight of a narrative collapsing under its own certainty. Whatever it was, it didn't look like the clarity Americans had been promised for years. And when clarity is promised and not delivered, people don't forget. The deeper controversy goes beyond Schiff himself and cuts into something far more uncomfortable. How many other political narratives rest on the same structure, the same appeal to hidden knowledge, the same demand that citizens suspend disbelief because we've seen things you haven't? How often has secrecy been used not just to protect information, but to protect a storyline? If one high-profile case can unravel this dramatically when documents are exposed, what happens when the spotlight turns elsewhere? That question lingers precisely because no one can confidently answer it. Trump's role in all of this remains divisive, as it always does. To his supporters, he exposed a long-running deception with brute force transparency. To his critics, he weaponized declassification to settle scores and reshape history in his favor. Both interpretations can exist at the same time, and that's what makes the episode so combustible. A man widely distrusted for his relationship with truth became the vehicle through which others were accused of distorting it. That irony alone is enough to keep the argument alive for years. There's also an uncomfortable reckoning for the media, one that can't be deflected forever. For years, viewers were told to trust certain voices because those voices had access. When access turned out not to be a substitute for verification, the media's role shifted from watchdog to amplifier in the public imagination. That doesn't mean reporters acted in bad faith, but it does mean the system rewarded confidence over caution. And systems that reward confidence tend to attract people very good at sounding certain. The episode leaves Americans with a harder, less satisfying task than choosing sides. It asks them to sit with ambiguity, to resist the urge for clean heroes and villains. It asks whether political accountability can survive when secrecy and performance blur together, and whether transparency is still meaningful when it arrives filtered through rivalry and spectacle. Those are not questions that trend for a day and disappear. They linger in the background of every future claim, every future briefing, every future insistence that the public should simply trust. In the end, no single press conference rewrites history, and no stack of documents settles every doubt. But moments like this reshape the boundaries of skepticism. They teach audiences what to listen for and what to question. They change how certainty sounds when it comes wrapped in authority. Adam Schiff's story, fairly or unfairly, became the cautionary example because it collided so publicly with its own record. And perhaps that is the most controversial takeaway of all. The real legacy of that day may not be about Trump or Schiff or Russia or impeachment, but about a country learning, slowly and painfully, that confidence is not evidence, secrecy is not proof, and moral certainty is not a substitute for transparency. Once that lesson takes hold, it doesn't belong to one party or one moment. It follows every official who steps in front of a camera and says, "Trust me, I've seen it."